Okay, so this is the June Circle of the Dark Mother meeting. I'm Mark Williams. As I said, Brandon is on, and Ariella was. I'm not sure if she got dropped or not, but we're some of the core members. As I said, we do a meeting every Sunday at 6:30 p.m. Every first Sunday. I'm sorry, not every Sunday. That would be a lot. And we do record them and put them on YouTube along with other things we do. So tonight we're going to talk about Sumerian history and their spirituality. There's a lot, that I could speak on this. I don't want it to be a 3-hour meeting. So if I miss anything and you want to ask questions, please feel free. You can type in the chat. You can interrupt me if I'm, in between thoughts, and we can have questions at the end as well. So let me move on to the next slide. Maybe I have to be in the right window. There we go. So the starting point is this presentation is an attempt to show the history of Mesopotamia. And Mesopotamia is an area that was called the Fertile Crescent, north of the Persian Gulf in what we would call the Middle East. It was in what is now Iran, Syria, and I believe the lower part of Turkey. But we're talking way back. Sumer was the first full civilization. There were some ones before that, but that is one of the big ones. And then later we get into Akkad, Assyria, Babylon, and we'll talk a little bit about all that. Oh, and actually it's Iraq, not Iran, although I think there's a little piece of it that hits Iran. So I put this together by studying many scholarly works, as well as actual historical documents. Of course, they've been translated to English. I can't read Sumerian. And I watched 2 10-hour courses that I took on Mesopotamia, as well as all the research. And the reason I did all this research is because, as I mentioned earlier, if you were on, my next book is going to be Sumer and Mesopotamian based. So I wanted to have the background for what I was talking about. I have a master's in theology, and I've studied many, many religions. I've been a Gnostic Kabbalist for almost 23 years, and that long working with Lilith as well as a whole bunch of other stuff. I read everything I can find on anything, but I try to focus sometimes on something like Mesopotamia. So let's move on to the next slide. So I did this little chart to show how truly ancient Mesopotamia is. If you look at 5000 BCE, there was Stone Age culture already there, and in 4500 BCE, Sumer became a power. There was then a Uruk period, which was Sumerian. They began writing cuneiform right around, well, the language probably started in 4500, but it was around 3250 that Sumerian cuneiform, full cuneiform came. And then we go into the dynastic period where they have kings, then Akkadian, Neo-Sumerian, Old Babylonian, and Assyrian go on for a long time. Then we get to Babylonian, Neo-Babylonian, and then the Jewish exile in Babylon. With around 500 BCE, Persia invades, and it ends Mesopotamian culture as it was. It still existed as fragments, but Persia pretty much wiped out everything they could. What's so amazing with this is we think of, Greek culture being so ancient. Well, there was Stone Age cultures in Greco-Roman countries, but we really didn't have a big culture till 2500, which was the Minoan culture. And then just before 1500, the Mycenaean culture. Linear B writing, which is the predecessor to Greek, didn't start until about 1250 BCE. And, Greco-Roman is old stuff, but when you look at Sumer, it's truly ancient. We now know that actually culture probably beyond just hunter-gatherers, at least started around 8000 BCE, maybe 9000. And we know that from things that were found in southern Turkey, some things found in Jordan, Israel, and pieces of things across Mesopotamia. If you've heard of Göbekli Tepe, that is in southern Turkey. What is southern Turkey today? It was called Anatolia, and was at the very tip of the Mesopotamian area. Göbekli Tepe is some of the oldest stuff we found. There's now older in that area as well, and they were used for ritual sites. One of the fascinating things is we thought culture started because hunter-gatherers decided to start farming and herding animals, and then they started building cities. Well, we found it's actually the opposite. They started building these megalithic sites for worship, and they started farming and herding, so they didn't have to leave their religious sites and then come back again. At least that's the theory, because things are so old. It's right before really farming. There's evidence of farming. China and Egypt have cultures, and also Indus Valley in what's now Pakistan, did start at similar times, but there was not, like Mesopotamia started first and the writing started before these. There was some pre-writing in Indus Valley, but no one's been able to translate it, and it's just like 5 or 6 characters on a tablet, where in Mesopotamia we find whole giant scripts. And the language is called cuneiform, and it was put on clay tablets. And that's why we have so many of them around, because after the clay tablets were heated, they became very hard. If you wrote on paper or parchment, it would have dissolved long ago, but the cuneiform tablets remained. So Mesopotamia had several periods that used the same writing. They used cuneiform, but they had different languages and cultures. These cultures always absorbed the previous one, combining with their own and coming up with something sort of a blend. And Mesopotamia was also the center of vast trade. We know that there was trade in Mesopotamia with Turkey or Anatolia, later on Egypt, and also Indus Valley, as well as all the other areas around Mesopotamia. And we know this because we find later on, we find language. We also have references to these other countries and their rulers, and we find jewelry and other stuff that was obviously from these areas because it's not found in Mesopotamia by default. So 4500 BCE was the Sumerian language was first written down. It's obviously much more ancient than that, but it's its own language group. It is not related to any known language. So the only way they were able to decipher it is they have found tablets that have Sumerian, Akkadian, Assyrian, and later on Egyptian and Greek. So they were able to figure out how to translate. Later, when the Akkadians came in, the Akkadians were Semitic speakers. So their language group is related to Hebrew and Arabic. Then the Assyrians came in. They also spoke in a Semitic language. And so Semitic languages continued. And then the Neo-Babylonian period returned to some of the Semitic Akkadian, but of course the Assyrian wasn't wiped out. It was still being used. And some Sumerian in written practice, but they don't believe orally. And then, as we know, around 500 BCE, Persia invades and slowly wipes out the Mesopotamian culture and religion. So some historical issues with studying something so ancient. We obviously can't trace culture and religion prior to written history. We can only make assumptions based on what art and symbols we find, but they're never definitive. You know, we have to guess until there's written language. And of course, with Sumerian not being related to any other language group, we can tell what they were translated to in Assyrian and in Akkadian, but we can't really be sure what they exactly meant, because those later cultures may have meant something slightly different based on their cultural background. We also see deities' names, images, and mythology change over time based on a culture and language. And this can be super confusing. I'll use an example. You know, Zeus actually was called many different things by many cultures in the Greco-Roman area. Some of them were similar to Zeus, or Zeus with added on pieces, but there was also Pater, which is based in the Indo-European language, is father. We see this also, of course, I got to throw in Lilith because I work with her. So in Sumerian, we don't know exactly how her name was pronounced, but it was composed of the syllables dim, mi, gi, dim, dot, mi, dot, gi. We don't know exactly what that means, although some of the translations seem to come out as she who comes by air, she who comes by wind. And the root dim mi is used for other deities. So dim mi, just dim mi is one deity, dim mi, Ki is another one, and there's several others where it's almost the same spelling, just with the extra syllable on the end. Later on, of course, her name then got picked up by the Akkadians, and then the Assyrians call her Lilitu, and we know that that name then got picked up by the Jewish people when they were in Babylonian exile, and her name changed to Lilith. But the stories evolve and change, and this is true for every deity. So sometimes it's really hard to see, like you look at an image, who is it? A great example is the Burney relief, which is an image that was called Queen of the Night. And you've probably seen it. It's an image of a woman who's naked with her arms up in the air with two rods and rings. And she has the canonical antler hat that deity wears. She has bird feet, and there's lions and owls next to her. Originally, that was thought to be Lilith. Then many started saying, no, it's actually Ishtar, because Ishtar was so prominent. But then others have said, no, it's Ereshkigal, who's Ishtar's sister. Ereshkigal was the queen of the underworld. Ishtar was the queen of, or the goddess of love and war. Lilith was sacred prostitution and a wind spirit, a wind deity, where there was wind spirits associated with her. So which one is it? The plaque was originally painted black. She had red skin. The owls and the lions were painted reds and whites and black, and her wings were white and black. The fact that she's naked, why? Why the bird feet? Sometimes that was very much associated with Lilith too, not so much with the other two. But again, as cultures change and grow, imagery goes back and forth. So we really don't know who that there was no inscription. We don't know who it was. So it could be any of the above. Or some other goddess. We don't even know who it is. We know it's a goddess because of the canonical hats. All gods and goddesses wore horn helmets. And the bigger of a deity they were, the bigger the horn helmet. And then the rod and the ring are very much like the Ankh in Egyptian tradition, meaning life and power. And the fact that this deity is holding two is really impressive, because most only hold one. That's another reason they think it might be Ishtar, because she was a very big goddess, and we'll talk more about that. And also because Mesopotamian culture isn't living anymore, and their language isn't either, it does become very difficult to figure out exactly, where it came from, where it was going. We had to sort of, make assumptions based on the later ones. So origins. The first two settlements in Mesopotamia was a culture called the Samara. And this culture featured beautiful painted pottery and irrigation systems to water their crops. This is before 6000 BCE, so this is pretty advanced. Around 6000 BC, the Halaf culture took over the area. This people group consisted of the original Samara culture, along with other Middle Eastern people groups that moved into the area. Their culture featured a different style of painted pottery, and they created stamp seals, possibly for the first time in history. Can you hear me? I see somebody saying, can anyone hear? Okay. So somebody can't?
I can hear you fine.
Okay. Um, so stamp seals were things that were made out of pottery or clay, and then they would put that in some kind of coloring, and they'd be able to press it on, or they could just push it into clay and make an image. So this is, again, very advanced. And then the next group was called the Ubaid, who entered the picture around 5,500. And I do want to call out, these are not the true names of these cultures. They didn't have writing. We don't know what they called themselves. These names are based on where the fragments of their stuff was first found in the countries that they existed at the time. The Ubaid started with small villages, but began to expand into towns. They farmed wheat, barley, and lentils, and herded various types of livestock. The Ubaid towns were made of several single-story, one-family homes, but there was also a centrally raised area with a structure on it, probably a temple. Now, we can't be sure, but later on, the Sumerians had these raised areas that had a statue of their deity, which was their temple. So most likely. And they had almost cities. They weren't quite big enough to be called cities, but these towns were fairly advanced for 5,500 BCE. Then we come to Sumer. This is probably one of the most well-known of the Mesopotamian cultures. It was the next group to inhabit Mesopotamia. It's totally unknown where the Sumerians came from, as their language doesn't fit into any known language group. And they called themselves what becomes Sumer later. The word Sumer means black-headed people. So we know they had dark hair, or they use black to represent something with their heads. There's different scholars that say they came from the north, from Anatolia, which may make sense because of some of the early structures there, from the eastern mountains, or from the Indus Valley civilization from Pakistan. But their true origins just not known. We have no idea where they came from. They give very vague information about, by the time they have writing, of where they originated. The first Sumerian city is named Eridu, and it's truly ancient. This states after kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was in Eridu. The Sumerian king list states that Eridu was around for 68,000 years. Now, we know that's probably not true, right? Because I think Homo sapiens didn't end up into that area until we're thinking 40,000 BC. So probably not 68,000 years, but the point is a long, long time. And we know Eridu existed previous to the Sumerians and was there with the previous cultures. It was just a smaller population. The city was the home of the god Enki. Each city, as you'll find, had their own god or goddess who saw over the city. And Enki is the first ruler, and he rules over fresh water, arts, and science. As the town expanded into a city, so did the temple, eventually becoming a ziggurat, which is a step pyramid. It's believed that there were as many as 3,000 people living in Eridu. And that may not sound so impressive, but for the time frame that we are talking, that is a lot of people in one place. Because remember, they had to feed them, they had to give them water, they had to have some kind of system of keeping the peace, they had to have structures. And it's believed in the beginning that Eridu and Sumer actually didn't have kings or really rulers. It was more like a council type thing. We don't know for sure, but that's one of the guesses we have. So Sumer continues. 200 kilometers northwest of Eridu lies the city of Uruk. And by 3500 BC, there were as many as 25,000 residents in this urban center. Huge. The Uruk period lasts from 4000 to 3100 BCE. And during this period, Sumeria spreads throughout the region with a bunch of city-states. Each city had a patron deity with a temple, and Uruk's patron was Inanna, who later becomes Ishtar, while Eridu continues to worship Enki. And these city-states were independently ruled and eventually have sort of warlords as their leaders. Items began to be mass produced instead of being made in people's homes, because with 25,000 people, you can't, make one plate at a time. You have to mass produce it, which means they're not as pretty as they were before. They tend to be a lot simpler with less decoration because they just got to crank them out. Because the cities became urban centers, trade and activity needed to be kept track of. And we found proto-cuneiform tablets dated somewhere around 3300. Later research is saying around 3300. And that full cuneiform was probably soon after, even though at one point we thought it was as late as 3000. And this writing is a form of pictographs, which each picture has simple meaning. Later, they become syllables. And what they would do is they would use a little wedge stylus and press into the soft clay to make their letters. Not everybody could write. In the cities, it was really a scribe class. The religious leaders probably could, but there were people who worked as people that would put things in cuneiform. The early dynastic period of Sumer runs from 2900 to 2334. And this is where the city-states go from councils and religious leaders to kings. The next civilization is Akkad. The Akkadian rule of Sumer lasted from 2334 to 2193 BCE. They came from north of Sumer, in Mesopotamia, and from the southern part of Anatolia, which is Turkey. They had no written language, so they adopted cuneiform. Now, they used their language, but they translated their language into the syllables that were needed to write cuneiform. Sumerian language was still spoken even through the Akkadian period, and became the official writing language for quite a while. So Sumerian language is an isolate language group, but Akkadian is distantly related to Arabic, Hebrew, and other Semitic languages. If you've heard of any kings of Sumer, it was King Sargon the Great. He led the Akkadians in their takeover of all of Sumer. So he unified most of Sumer into one country instead of city-states. It was a political and religious one. What he did is he would replace the political and religious leaders in a city so that they were all his people instead of the people that were running the city before. But he did let the people keep their god or goddess. They kept that as the one for that city. The capital moved to the city of Agade or Agade. Sargon shifted worship to Ishtar, which is the Akkadian version of Inanna. And then Akish-Zababa, which was a warrior god that was not Sumerian nature in origin, because these were Sargon's patron deities. Now, he didn't stop other people from worshiping other deities, but those became the primary ones of the country. After Akkad fell, which happened because Sargon died, and his kids just weren't, able to really keep up and be the presence he was. So it ended up in chaos with no strong leader. The state fell and it became city-states. And then a group called the Gutians swept in from the east and destroyed the city, which was already a mess with famine, drought, and political instability. The Akkadians then took their kingship back to Uruk, and the Gutians took over most of Akkad. So Sumer became a very small country or city-state focused around Uruk. And it was the Sumer and Akkadian Empire is what they called themselves. Eventually, kingship returned to Sumer around 2112 BCE and launched the Neo-Sumerian dynasty from 2112 to 2004. And then Amorites began to migrate down into Mesopotamia, mixing with the Sumerian people. Because of some of this mixing, the culture changed. I mean, cultures change all the time by people coming in or leaving. But eventually, the city of Babylon became a major city in the region. The kingship still called their land Sumer and Akkad, with Sumer in the south and Akkad in the north. They never called their empire Babylon. It was their major city. But the Greeks kept referring to the country as Babylonia, and it stuck. So when you hear of Babylon, it was actually a city in the land of Sumer and Akkad. And it was the Greeks who really made it known as Babylonia. And everyone else considered themselves Akkadian because their language was Akkadian. Babylon and Assyria. The Old Babylon period was a very short period in Mesopotamian history. It was a key city that retook the lands of Mesopotamia when the Akkadian Empire began to fail. Unfortunately, the Northern Assyrian Empire, which was an empire north in, again, northern Mesopotamia and also in what's now Turkey, invaded and took over all of Mesopotamia. It's the biggest that land was as a unified country. And that was from 2025 BC until 1021 BCE. So that empire lasted for 1,000 years. Invaders disrupted the empire and returned the land to independent city-states controlled by several powers. The region was ruled by Assyria and Babylon for the last period of Mesopotamian history. So it was those two were the major powers, but there were still city-states that were sort of independent. Nebuchadnezzar II, who lived from 626 to 539 BCE, is the king of Babylon that assaulted Jerusalem and eventually destroyed the temple in 586, and a large number of the population was taken as exiles into Babylon. And what needs to be said there is a lot of Hebrew and Jewish religion was changed dramatically by their time in Babylon. In fact, a lot of scholars believe that some of what they would call the Torah and we would call the Old Testament, Torah and some other stuff, was actually, some of it was written in Babylon. And the reason was, since they were out of their homeland, they didn't have as much way of orally transmitting stuff. So they wrote a lot of stuff down to keep their culture intact and their religion intact. This is where deities like Lilith were brought in. Of course, since they weren't the gods of the Israelites, they often were demonized. Some were turned into angels, some were turned into demons, and some were just mixed in with alternate versions of Yahweh. The Neo-Babylonian Empire was the last civilization to consider themselves Sumerian. Cyrus the Great and the Persian Empire invaded and took over the region, ending the land of Sumer and Akkad as its own empire. Cyrus told the Babylonian people that the god Marduk came to him. Marduk was a major deity at this time, and one of the major deities of Babylon. Came to him and told him he would be the rightful ruler of the country because their current king was not doing his job properly. So this is how he convinced the people that he was to be the rightful ruler, so they didn't fight him when he invaded. He even went through the Sumerian kingship ritual to take power rightfully, in quotes. This was an act where the king, along with a statue of Marduk, would be paraded through the city, and then the king would take a vow to Marduk and to the country. But this wasn't a ploy. He didn't really dedicate himself to the land of Sumer or to Marduk. He did it to prevent rebellion. It worked, and over time, he wiped out the Sumerian Akkadian cultures and religion, replacing them with that of Persia. So let's talk a little bit about Sumerian. We're going to get into spirituality now. So let's talk a little bit about Sumerian spiritual entities. So in Sumerian religion, there are gods, goddesses, spirits, and demons, but very different than we would consider them in Western culture. Gods and goddesses are born into their role based on being descended from the original first pair of gods, known as Anu and Namu. Namu has a couple different names. I think there's also Amu and a couple other versions, but that's the most commonly translated. Gods always follow the laws of order, and even though they may do something harmful, they are always considered benevolent. So even though sometimes some of the gods would kill people or bring plagues, they were considered doing the law and order of the gods, and that made them doing the right thing. Spirits are any non-physical, non-deity. They could even be what we would consider minor gods and goddesses, but they are not descended from Anu and Namu. And then demons are actually not separate from gods, goddesses, and spirits. Demons are either gods or spirits who break with the law of order and do what they want. So a god, a goddess, or a spirit can also be considered a demon. And that's because they don't follow the laws of order and do what they want. They refuse to follow what other gods dictate. It is possible for a god or goddess to also be a demon. And as I said earlier, Sumerian language is written in cuneiform on clay tablets. The written language is composed of syllables instead of letters. In Sumerian, the word dim-mi with an R after it means gods and or goddesses. Dim-mi with an IR after it means gods, and dim-mi with an ER means goddess. So there's three versions of this word that mean gods and goddesses, gods and or goddesses. One means a god and one means a goddess. And then there are certain deities that have dim.me something as their name, not all of them. But Lilith is one of them that has that dim-me and then GI at the end for her name. The way we know, I mean, there's obviously central deities that were the deities of each city. So we know about them because they were prominently mentioned in literature. But there were actually hundreds of gods and goddesses, and many that were gods or goddesses and demons. And we can tell, we do know who they were, because there is actually a document called, we call it, the Sumerian to Assyrian god list. And what it is it has in Sumerian the name of a god or goddess, and then their Assyrian name. And only gods and goddesses are in this list, although they may also be a demon. And you'll find all the ones you expect, like Enki, Marduk, Inanna, who is Ishtar later on. We also see Lilith, who is in the list as dim.me.gi, and then as the Assyrian name of Lilitu. So this god list is really important, because if you have a question if somebody was a god or not, you can go look in this list. Unfortunately, a lot of them cost over $200 to get a translation, but a few of the scholarly sites do have it for free. It's ugly. I mean, it's not a pretty site. And you have to figure out how to search it, because all of the words are separated. The Sumerian has periods between the syllables, and I think it's the Assyrian has dashes. So if you just search for Lilitu, you'll never find her, because it's Lil-it-2. And the Sumerian is dim.me.gi. So you sort of have to get creative and figure out what you're looking for. And I did find that and go through it to do a lot of my research. The plaque to the side, we do believe that the central figure in that is Inanna/Ishtar. She was very prominent. You know, at one point she's the main female deity, and in certain cities she was the goddess who was worshipped. So Mesopotamian religion. First of all, if you look at the pantheon list of Sumerian gods and goddesses, this is not exhaustive, because remember, there's hundreds of deities, but these are the main ones that were over cities. There were also monsters, which were descended from the gods, especially Tiamat and Abzu, and they were sort of deities, but they just call them something that's translated to monsters. And you notice there's a whole bunch of mixes where different people are married to different people and have kids by different. It becomes sort of like a Dallas, or a soap opera of deities and how they married and mated. The Mesopotamian religion, beliefs, and practices of the Sumerians, Akkadians, the Babylonians, and the Assyrians who inhabited ancient Mesopotamia. And basically, the Sumerian religion probably brought in what was there already, and it moves along, and it changes and evolves. And then the Akkadians come in, and it evolves and changes more. And then the Assyrians and the Babylonians, and so on until the culture ended. These beliefs and practices form a single stream of tradition, even though it does change in its Sumerian in origin. But again, changed and modified as time went on. The most powerful and important deities in the pantheon were sometimes called the seven gods who decree: An, Enlil, Enki, Ninhursag, Nana, Utu, and Inanna. These major deities in Sumerian mythology were associated with specific celestial bodies. So one is associated with the sun, one is associated with Venus. Not shockingly, Inanna is the one associated with Venus. And so these seven were also associated with which was called the Ladder of Lights, which we'll discuss later. The Ladder of Lights is an early Kabbalah. So we do believe that Jewish Kabbalah at least incorporates this, if not descends from it. And again, there were literally hundreds of deities in the Mesopotamian pantheon. Magic. The magical practices of ancient Sumer, Akkad, and Babylon are surprisingly similar to what modern occultists practice. Astrology, invocation, exorcism, crystals and stones, flowers and herbs, oils, flames, originally fire turning into oil lamps and eventually candles, and statues were at the heart of their practice, which is very similar to what a lot of people use today. So really, all of what we do now pretty much comes out of Mesopotamia. And if you think about it, that's not surprising, because we're all human. We all came from a similar, group of people, and culture moved back and forth between these countries. We used to think they were pretty isolate, but they absolutely weren't. They interacted all the time. So these ancient cultures believed that these elements all held magical properties that could be used in spells and other workings. Invocation and exorcism were two sides of a coin. So invocation was used to call upon gods, demons, and spirits, where exorcism was used to dispel hostile entities. And they usually used a deity or a demon to bind the hostile entity to cast it out. For instance, Pazuzu, who was a god over crops and also famine, was used to protect mothers and their children from the goddess Lamashtu. Pazuzu and Lamashtu are both deities. They're both descended from Anu and Mamu, or Namu. Pazuzu is a god and a demon, and Lamashtu is a goddess and a demon. Lamashtu was horrifying. She was a combination of many animals in an anthropomorphic form, and later ideas on Lilith that came into Jewish religion really were based on Lamashtu. She was believed to kill children and eat the bone marrow. She would kill and torture expectant mothers. And this was Lamashtu. She was considered horrible. So even though she was a goddess and a demon, she was not a nice figure in their religion. But Pazuzu, who you may have heard of because he's the one that's used in The Exorcist. His statue is used to be the demon, supposedly, that was in that movie. But he was actually a god in Sumer. He was fairly ugly from a standpoint. His face is very monstrous, and that was believed to what would scare away Lamashtu, which is really interesting because she was really horrific looking. But they would use his image to banish Lamashtu. So they'd use one god demon to banish a goddess demon. Oils were used very heavily in these cultures, and they were made for various purposes. One of the major purposes was anointing the body for protection, good luck, or blessings, but they also used it to anoint statues and the dead. It's really interesting because if you read the practices with oil that are detailed in the Hebrew Torah, which of course we call the Old Testament, they're strikingly similar to practices used in Babylon. In fact, I've read scholarly articles where scholars have the original Babylonian in cuneiform, and they compare it to later Jewish writing from the Torah, and the actual steps used to use the oil are identical. The only change is instead of the Sumerian deities, they use Yahweh, El, Elohim. They use the Hebrew names for God instead. So if you read any of those oil practices, you can use them based on a Sumerian tradition, if you were so inclined. And again, this isn't surprising because one, there was a lot of contact between them. They were literally on the same piece of the world, not that far away. There was trade, and then of course Babylon conquered them, and many of the Jews were exiled into Babylon. So of course there was cultural exchange. So the Ladder of Lights. These ancient people were very practiced astrologers. They knew about the major planets that were visible by visual. They centered on the 7 spheres of the heavens: the Earth, the Sun, the Moon, Mercury, Venus, Mars, and Jupiter. This list of spheres was called the Ladder of Lights and is displayed much like the Tree of Life in Kabbalah, with a lightning bolt form showing the movement of energy between the spheres. So if you do know Kabbalah, the Tree of Life glyph is composed of 7 spheres on the bottom and 3 at the top. And the Ladder of Lights really just lines up perfectly with the 7 separative construction, the 7 lower spheres. So it's very, very likely that either they shared information, or because this is older, the Ladder of Lights was the prequel that then became Kabbalah later. Just amazing, because this Ladder of Lights goes back to 2000 BCE that we know of, and maybe earlier. So again, very interesting stuff, and pointing again to basically the things we do in our practice comes from this tradition or other traditions that either worked with them or interacted with them or picked up the same stuff. If you even look at the ones that are more removed, like Native American or Asian culture, some of the paradigms seem very different, but there are still a lot of little pieces that fit together in the same kind of structure. Now, I'm not saying that Native American and Chinese, let's say, cultures came from Sumer, but either they developed independently with the same ideas, or this stuff is so ancient that the forebears of all of this shared it. And that is very likely. Humans moved into Europe, they believe, around 40, I think it was around 40,000 BCE. And at that point, there weren't that many, Homo sapiens. There were Homo neanderthals, they were Denisovans, they were still some previous beings from our ancestry, but Homo sapiens literally moved across Europe and Asia. So the fact that this is all shared ideas is not shocking. And if you believe in a spiritual concept of it, if it's also coming from some kind of spiritual truth, not the truth, but a manifestation of somebody's knowledge or experience, then it makes sense too that it would come to all these cultures. This image is not the Ladder of Lights, but I used it because there's no really good depiction of the Ladder of Lights. There are references to it in text, but the pictures are very rare to find, and they're not very clear. So I used this because it at least gave some feel for it. You will notice too, if you're familiar with later Zoroastrian tradition, which was a dualistic religion in the Middle East, which Christianity actually takes a lot from, you'll notice the winged being with the little image in the center, at the center of this, and that was an image of Ahura Mazda the god of light in Zoroastrianism. So they definitely took this iconography also. And I think that is the end. Yes, that is the end of the deck. But ready to talk about anything you want. I am going to close out the recording. So I will close the recording out now and we'll go to questions and comments.